The global shipping industry moves over 80% of everything you own. The phone in your hand, the fuel in your car, the food on your table. For decades, it moved quietly, cheaply, and reliably, the invisible backbone of modern life. That era is over. We are now living through the most sustained disruption to global maritime trade since the Second World War. Three critical choke points, the Panama Canal, the Red Sea, and the Strait of Hormuz, are simultaneously under pressure from climate change, armed conflict, and geopolitical brinkmanship. Freight rates remain over 90% above pre-pandemic benchmarks. War risk insurance premiums have surged 40-fold on some routes, and there is no plan to fix any of it. This is not a temporary crisis. This is a structural breakdown, and the cost is being paid by every single person on Earth. Why global shipping will not recover anytime soon. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, you first need to understand something most people never think about. Shipping is fundamentally inelastic. When economists say a system is inelastic, they mean it cannot quickly respond to shocks. You cannot build a new container ship in a week. You cannot train a qualified crew in a month. You cannot dig a new canal in a year. The global fleet, the port infrastructure, the specialized workforce, these things take decades to scale. So when a shock hits, a canal closes, a war erupts, a pandemic scrambles demand, the system cannot absorb it. Prices do not move by percentages, they multiply. In January 2022, the Shanghai Containerized Freight Index hit an all-time high. The pandemic had exposed every fragility in the system. Ports were clogged, containers were in the wrong places, crews were stranded, and yet the industry assumed it would heal, that rates would normalize, that the system would settle back to its old equilibrium. It never did. By mid-2026, more than 4 years later, key shipping benchmarks remain over 90% above pre-pandemic averages. The system did not recover. It simply reset to a much higher and more volatile baseline. And behind that reset lie three specific places, three narrow passages of water that hold the entire global economy hostage. The Panama Canal handles roughly 5% of global maritime trade. For a century, it has been the shortcut. The reason ships do not have to sail around the entire South American continent to move goods between the Atlantic and the Pacific, but the canal operates on fresh water. Every ship that passes through its locks flushes millions of gallons of lake water out to sea, and that fresh water comes from rainfall that climate change is making increasingly unreliable. In late 2023 and early 2024, a severe drought, driven by the El Niño climate pattern and amplified by long-term warming, slashed the canal's daily transits from around 36 ships to as few as 18, half the normal capacity. The queue of waiting vessels stretched for weeks. Some shipping companies paid millions of dollars just to jump the line at auction. The canal has since recovered partially, but the underlying vulnerability has not gone away. Panama's rainfall patterns are becoming more erratic, not less. The Canal Authority is exploring expensive engineering solutions, new reservoirs, water-saving basins, but none of them will be operational this decade. The Panama Canal was designed for a climate that no longer exists, and until billions of dollars of infrastructure are built to adapt it, every dry season becomes a roll of the dice for global supply chains. If the Panama crisis is driven by climate, the Red Sea crisis is driven by conflict. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow gateway at the southern end of the Red Sea, is the only entry point to the Suez Canal. Roughly 10 to 12% of global maritime trade passes through this corridor. It is the fastest route between Asia and Europe. Since late 2023, Yemen's Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, have been attacking commercial vessels in these waters. What began as a campaign tied to the war in Gaza has evolved into a sustained strategic disruption of one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. The response from the shipping industry has been to simply avoid the Red Sea entirely. Most major carriers now route their Asia-Europe services around the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope. This detour adds 7 to 14 days to each voyage. It burns over $1 million in extra fuel on a single round trip, and it consumes ship capacity that the global fleet simply does not have to spare. In early 2024, Asia-Europe spot shipping rates briefly tripled. The cost of insuring a vessel transiting the Red Sea ballooned. And despite occasional announcements from carriers like Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd about resuming Red Sea passages, the situation remains unstable, dependent on a conflict that shows no sign of resolution. Every ship that rounds the Cape of Good Hope instead of sailing through Suez is a ship the global supply chain did not budget for. And every extra day at sea is a day of inventory that is not on shelves, not in warehouses, not available to sell. And then there is the Strait of Hormuz, the most dangerous choke point of them all. This narrow passage between Iran and Oman is the only way in or out of the Persian Gulf by sea. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil passes through it, 20% of global liquefied natural gas. It is the single most critical energy artery on the planet. Since early March 2026, when the United States and Israel launched military operations against Iran, the Strait of Hormuz has been transformed from a shipping lane into a battleground. Iran restricted passage for most commercial vessels. The United States imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ships and ports. Both sides have fired on commercial vessels. Both sides have boarded ships in international waters. In April, a fragile ceasefire was agreed. In June, a memorandum of understanding began 60 days of negotiations. And in July, that ceasefire collapsed, with Iran launching attacks on U.S. military sites in Bahrain and Kuwait, and the United States declaring the agreement over. The financial consequences are staggering. Before the conflict, war risk insurance for a $100 million tanker transiting the Persian Gulf cost roughly $250,000 per voyage. During the peak of the crisis, those premiums surged to between $3 and $10 million per transit, a 40-fold increase. Even when the strait remains technically open, the uncertainty alone paralyzes commercial decision-making. A ship owner contemplating a Gulf voyage must weigh the risk of a missile strike, a boarding, or a detention, and then price that risk into the freight rate. Those costs do not disappear when a ceasefire is announced. They linger in every contract, every insurance policy, and every supply chain that depends on Gulf energy. What makes this moment genuinely unprecedented is not any single crisis in isolation. It is that all three are happening at the same time, and the system has no spare capacity left to absorb the shock. When a ship is forced to sail around Africa instead of through Suez, it is not just burning extra fuel. It is occupying a vessel that could have been somewhere else. When the Panama Canal restricts transits, it is not just delaying cargo, it is forcing ships onto longer alternate routes, compounding the capacity crunch. And when the Strait of Hormuz becomes a war zone, it is not just raising oil prices, it is making every other shipping cost higher, because fuel is the single largest operating expense for any vessel. This is what economists call a compound shock. Each disruption magnifies the others, and the shipping industry, built on razor-thin efficiency and just-in-time logistics, has no buffer left to absorb the cascade. In July 2026, container spot rates surged to a post-pandemic high. U.S. importers were rushing to front-load cargo ahead of tariff uncertainty. Retail inventory restocking across Western economies was significantly stronger than expected, and the Red Sea diversion continued to consume roughly 10 to 15% of effective global container capacity, a permanent drain on a fleet already running at full utilization. Carriers have learned the lessons of the pandemic era. They now enforce strict capacity discipline, controlling supply to match demand, introducing general rate increases and peak season surcharges that have nothing to do with their actual operating costs. The rates are not being driven by fuel or labor. They are being driven by scarcity. And here is where the crisis gets deeply unequal. Wealthy economies can absorb higher freight costs. They get passed on to consumers at slightly higher prices, annoying but survivable. But for developing nations, for countries in Africa, South Asia, and Latin America, the impact is existential. When shipping costs surge, importers in Lagos or Dhaka or Lima cannot simply pay more and move on. They lose access to goods entirely. Their supply chains break. Their export competitiveness evaporates because the cost of getting their products to market in Europe or North America now exceeds the profit margin on the sale. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has estimated that sustained shipping disruptions could add between 0.2 and 0.5 percentage point to global consumer price inflation. That may sound small, but compounded across every good transported by sea, it translates into tens of billions of dollars in additional costs borne by households around the world. And that estimate was made before the Strait of Hormuz became an active war zone. So the question becomes, when does this end? And the uncomfortable answer is, it does not. The Panama Canal will remain vulnerable to drought until climate adaptation infrastructure is built, a project measured in years and billions of dollars. The Red Sea will remain dangerous as long as the Houthis maintain the capability and will to attack shipping, a geopolitical problem with no military solution in sight. And the Strait of Hormuz will remain a flashpoint as long as Iran and the United States are locked in a cycle of escalation, a confrontation that has persisted across multiple administrations and shows no sign of permanent resolution. And the threat is metastasizing. In April 2026, Indonesia's finance minister floated the idea of charging tolls for passage through the Strait of Malacca, another of the world's critical maritime corridors. Though the proposal was quickly withdrawn, it revealed a dangerous new logic. If Iran can weaponize Hormuz, why cannot others weaponize their choke points? In the South China Sea, Beijing continues to assert increasingly aggressive territorial claims, with commercial vessels reporting harassment and detention. In the Black Sea, Russia's war on Ukraine has rewritten the rules of maritime access. The International Maritime Bureau reported that 2025 saw the highest level of piracy incidents in 5 years. Elizabeth Braw of the Atlantic Council put it bluntly: "We have not seen the oceans this turbulent and dangerous since countries met to establish rules decades ago." What she is describing is the collapse of the rules-based maritime order, the system of treaties, norms, and mutual interests that enabled global trade to balloon from $60 billion in the 1950s to more than $25 trillion today. That system assumed that the oceans were neutral, that commercial vessels could sail freely, regardless of flag or cargo. That assumption is now visibly breaking down. This is the new unstable normal: constant rerouting, elevated costs, permanent risk management, a shipping industry that operates not on efficiency but on survival and passes every cost along the chain to the end consumer. The era of cheap, predictable global shipping is over, and there is no plan, no institution, and no political will capable of bringing it back. Here is what this means in practical terms. Everything transported by sea, and that is almost everything, will cost more, not temporarily, structurally. Supply chains that were built on just-in-time delivery will be forced to hold more inventory, operate with longer lead times, and absorb higher insurance costs. Companies that assume stable freight rates in their business models will need to rewrite those models. And governments that counted on cheap global trade to suppress inflation will find that lever increasingly out of reach. For the maritime professional, this is not just a crisis, it is a career-defining moment. The skills required to navigate this new environment, understanding war risk insurance, optimizing for alternative routes, managing the contractual implications of force majeure and deviation, are more valuable than they have been in a generation. At SeaMayors, we will continue to track these developments, the freight rates, the choke point dynamics, the geopolitical shifts, and bring you the analysis that matters for your career and your business. The oceans are becoming more dangerous. Understanding why and what to do about it is no longer optional, it is essential. If this analysis added value to your understanding, subscribe and turn on notifications. Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you are working in the industry and seeing these dynamics play out in real time. The conversation does not end here.